Wars are raging around the world. Many are pitting East against West, with both supplying arms to countries they support. The United Nations has been accused of weakness, paralysed by vetoes held by the major powers. So could these global conflicts turn into a third world war? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Tom McRae. A global conflict has been avoided since 1945 and the end of World War II, and its horrors of the Holocaust and atomic bombs dropped on Japan by the US. Now, much of today's international political architecture, such as the United Nations, stems from the aftermath formed by world leaders determined such a disaster would never happen again. Yet conditions comparable to those in World War II are being suffered by many people today, such as in Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, Yemen, Myanmar and Central Africa, to mention but a few. And in recent years, hundreds of thousands of people have been killed or injured in Syria, Libya, Iraq and Afghanistan as a result of foreign military action, often with East and West backing different sides. But up until now, there's been no outright fighting between Russia or China and the US. But serious conflicts or standoffs between their allies are ongoing. United Nations peacemaking efforts have frequently been limited by deadlock in the Security Council. So is there a real danger of such global conflict erupting into a third world war? We'll be asking our guest this question and many more in just a few moments. But first, Imogen Kimber reports on where the current flashpoints are.
Carnage and destruction on an unprecedented scale in Gaza, with 100,000 people either dead or injured. President Joe Biden said from the outset of Israel's war on Gaza, the US did not want conflict to escalate to other countries, despite sending weapons and warships. Yet its impact is being felt across the region, with concerns growing that it could spread.
This is an incredibly volatile time in the Middle East. I would argue that we have not seen a situation as dangerous as the one we're facing now across the region since at least 1973, and arguably even before that.
Linked to Israel's Gaza war in neighbouring Jordan, 3 US soldiers were killed in a drone strike, blamed on an Iranian-backed militia in Iraq that's still recovering from the catastrophic war launched by the West 21 years ago. And in southern Lebanon, the Iranian-backed armed group Hezbollah quickly joined the fight, with ongoing exchanges of fire with Israeli forces across the border. Another group allied to Iran, the Houthis in Yemen, is attacking Western cargo ships, saying it's a retaliation for Israel's war on Gaza and to support the Palestinians. The US and UK have begun bombing Yemen in response.
The US, together with the UK and some of their other allies, have violated and trampled on all conceivable norms of international law, including the UN Security Council resolution, which only called for protecting commercial navigation. Nobody authorised anyone to bomb Yemen.
In Europe, as NATO and Western states continue to send weapons and financial support to Ukraine 2 years after Russia's invasion, there are fears the conflict could spread across the continent. Countries in Europe have been increasing their military preparedness, with long-time neutral Finland joining NATO and neutral Sweden close to doing the same. Moving east, the US and China have both been carrying out military exercises in the South China Sea, with intensifying focus on Taiwan that Beijing claims as part of its territory, to be taken by force if necessary. And there is rising tension on the Korean peninsula, with North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un saying unification is no longer a possibility. South Korea and Japan are strengthening their military forces, while Russia has become a stronger ally of Pyongyang since its invasion of Ukraine. Conflicts are also raging elsewhere, with war in Sudan and volatility in South Sudan. That follows the war in neighbouring Ethiopia's Tigray region, in which hundreds of thousands of people were killed and where tensions remain high. With more confrontations pitting East directly against West, many are now questioning whether the world is sliding towards a wider global conflict, along with the horror that would bring. Imogen Kimber, Aljazeera for Inside Story.
Okay, let's bring in our guests now. In New York is Chris Hedges, former Middle East bureau chief of the New York Times and a Pulitzer Prize winner. In Birmingham, UK, Scott Lucas is a professor at University College Dublin and edits EA Worldview that provides news and analysis through those facing conflict, deprivation and change. And in Beijing, Huiyao Wang is the founder and president of the Centre for China and Globalization and a former councillor to China's State Council, which is China's cabinet. Thank you very much for your time and for joining us here on Inside Story. If we could start broadly and then focus in, drill down on the specific conflicts that are happening around the world at this point in time. Chris, if I can begin with you. What do you make of the premise that we're sliding inevitably towards World War III?
I don't know that anything is inevitable, but these conflicts are very dangerous because whatever the intentions, and I don't think that Iran, Hezbollah, or the United States seek a regional conflict by exacerbating tensions within the regions through strikes and counterstrikes, whether that's in Yemen, whether that's in Iraq, whether that's in southern Lebanon, you propel yourself closer and closer to a conflict. I think what concerns me as an American most is that the inner circle around Joe Biden, that's Antony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and Brett McGurk, have no real understanding of the Middle East. In the case of Blinken, he sees the Middle East through the lens of the Netanyahu government. None of them speak Arabic. None of them are particularly familiar with the culture or the history or even the grievances. That's when we saw Blinken essentially go around and try and lobby Arab leaders to take Palestinian refugees from Gaza. It just shows how tone deaf he is. All of these people are strong militarists. Sullivan, of course, stoking the tensions primarily with China. But Biden himself, who was calling for war with Iraq 5 years before the U.S. invaded. And that's what worries me the most. It's this kind of incompetence, historical, linguistic, cultural, I would say even political illiteracy, and then the ability to bypass Congress to not only funnel weapons, billions in weapons to sustain the genocide in Gaza, but carry out strikes, whether that's in Yemen or Iraq or anywhere else, essentially without consulting Congress. So from an American perspective, this is a very dangerous development within the State Department and the intelligence community. Many people consider what these three people around Biden are doing as very ill-advised and very dangerous. So this incompetence is something that worries me tremendously, especially the longer that the conflict in Gaza continues, and I don't see any signs within the Biden administration that they have any intention of stopping it. Indeed, they spend most of their time in Jerusalem and Riyadh.
Yeah, indeed. We heard Blinken in the story we played at the beginning of this show basically say that the world is more dangerous now than in any time in the last 50 years. Scott, do you believe those words? Do you see it the same way?
I don't like to use terms like World War III or even Cold War 2.0 for two reasons. The first is it leads to exaggeration, which means we miss looking at each case on an individual basis. And secondly, it leads to sweeping generalizations to blame a particular group like Chris has just done. What I would point you to is to say, look, we have had a series of conflicts around the world for some time, but the stakes have been raised in the past few years, probably by three catalysts. The first is, before the current Israel-Gaza conflict, we saw the bloody repression of movements across the Middle East, especially in Syria, where the Assad regime, backed by Russia, killed hundreds of thousands of people. Secondly, we saw the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. And then, of course, we had Hamas's mass killings in Israel, followed by Israel's mass killings that continue on a daily basis, killing tens of thousands in Gaza. And each of those flashpoints, each of those catalysts can be used by various actors, not just the U.S., can be used by Russia, can be used by China, can be used by someone else to push their local power plays And when you have an intersection of different conflicts, let's say between Israel, Gaza, Syria, Iran, and Iraq, then you have the possibility that a particular conflict can expand into the region and then beyond.
Right. Henry, I'd like to get the sense of what it is like in China. It feels like in the West there has been, in recent days, more and more talk of this concept of World War III being closer than ever before. Is there any talk or concern within China of this?
Well, I think absolutely. I think that, even though this just seems a bit far from China, but absolutely it's really affected China also, because China, being the largest trading nation in the world, I mean, we have actually heavily dependent on those traffic and those, ocean shipping and all those import-export. So what I see is the world is really getting more dangerous. I agree. I mean, the world is getting more dangerous and more risky. And there's two levels of that. First, I think there's all those regional issues because we are getting into a multipolar world, and then there's no multipolar world system to sustain that. So we see that if there's no consensus, then there's a lot of regional conflicts, spread around. I mean, because Russian war in Ukraine is one example, but also we have seen this Palestinian-Israel conflict, which is very deadly, and its spillover effect is getting loom and large and affecting all the big countries. I mean, U.S., UK jumped in already, and then Iran could fight back, and then that could spill over even more countries, and then you see the whole world disrupted, trade and everything. So the second, I think, is most important is there's no trust between the major powers and the P5 member country of the UN. Basically, it's not really working together, and that's really, I think, probably can be one of the main reasons that the world can't get its act together to really maintain the stability and order. So I think we have to really think about how we can maintain this peace. I mean, like China suggests, like Israel-Palestinian conflict, let's have a World Peace Summit, have a high-level summit, and really let's go come to the table and talk about that. Rather than, we see only one country back and forth, and that's really not help. So we need to really think hard and find a solution to this going crisis.
Yeah, I don't think many people would disagree that trust is probably at its lowest point ever between the major players here. Chris, if I can go back to you, you're obviously scathing about President Biden and the US's handling of what has happened in Gaza. Since October the 7th, almost on a daily basis, they've said that they don't want this war to escalate, to broaden out into a regional war. But since then, we have seen it creep to more and more countries, whether it's Yemen or Lebanon, into other countries like that. What they are saying is very different from what they are doing, isn't it?
Yeah, because the war could not be sustained without U.S. munitions, which have come in by the tens of thousands. The tank shells, the artillery shells, everything else is produced in the United States. They've, of course, vetoed the ceasefire resolution. So on the one hand, they want it contained. On the other hand, they fuel the conflict. And that, of course, is a contradiction in terms of goals. If you want to mitigate the possibilities of a regional conflict, you have to end the genocide that Israel is carrying out in Gaza. And I would say that, the Arab regimes, countries like Egypt in particular, they don't want to see this escalate. But of course, within the street, I just came back from the Middle East, in fact, was in Doha visiting Aljazeera, the anger is quite widespread and quite palpable. So yes, I blame the Biden administration for not using its leverage. It has the leverage, but because Congress is bought and paid for by the Israel lobby, it's not going to use it. There's a political cost that Biden doesn't want to pay. And so we're watching a situation now where there's widespread famine. 500,000 Palestinians are at starvation level. Infectious diseases are spreading. Palestinians are eating grass. 90% of them are unhoused, many living in the open under the rain of the winter rains. I mean, this is just staggering in terms of the catastrophe that has been the humanitarian catastrophe that has been orchestrated, and it quite rightly triggers a reaction. Remember, Yemen itself suffered like this. 400,000, I think, Yemenis died during the war and siege led by Saudi Arabia with the full backing of the United States. So, of course, they're reacting because they understand. But yes, I really think the blame lies at this moment with Washington for not intervening and using the power that it has to end this conflict, or at least bring forth a ceasefire or a prolonged pause.
Okay, Scott, is this all the United States' fault, the prolonged killing on a daily basis of Palestinians in Gaza, because they have, I guess, backed unilaterally Israel? And do you think that the conflict in Gaza and in the Middle East at this point in time is the one that's most likely to, I guess, spread further and potentially escalate to become a world war?
I agree with Chris. In a sense, and I've been a scathing critic of American actions in recent months because they're not using leverage to try to pull the Israelis back. But one of the problems we have in a lot of commentary is it's only about the United States. It needs to be widened out. And let me give you two examples with Israel and Gaza. The first is that the U.S., along with much of the international community, did try to hold the Netanyahu war cabinet back from a ground offensive. They tried to hold them back from an expansive bombing campaign after October 7th. And at the end of the day, you have to say that the agency, the decision to go out with that all-out campaign, that mass killing inside Gaza, is with the Israeli war cabinet. It's not that the U.S. told them to do so. The U.S. didn't want this to happen. But the second example I think is pertinent is that there are others in the region, not just the U.S., who are involved, and there are others who will take advantage of this for their own purposes. So, for example, the Houthi rebels who control much of Yemen are attacking commercial shipping in the Red Sea on the guise of supporting Gazans, but also to advance their legitimacy, their power in the area. Iran, which has serious domestic problems, is trying to use the regional conflict to say, well, we're the head of the axis of resistance. And that is leading to increased confrontations, not only between Iran and Israel, but between the Iran-backed militia who are firing on U.S. personnel. So there's a kaleidoscope of actors I think we have to get in sight. And very quickly on your question, I think the Israel-Gaza conflict can definitely expand to be a regional war because of all of this. But also, don't forget that Russia's invasion of Ukraine could expand across Europe if Vladimir Putin continues to pursue that idea of an expansionist policy to knock back, quote, the West and NATO, as well as to try to control Kyiv.
Yeah. Well, the United Nations was effectively set up to try and prevent conflicts like this, and especially stopping them from spreading even further. But many critics of the United Nations have basically said that they're weak, they're paralysed by the major powers using vetoes constantly. Henry, what do you think needs to happen at the United Nations? You were talking about, the major powers coming together, but I mean, what is the likelihood of that actually happening? And even if you could get them in the same room, how openly are they going to be able to talk and actually find any solutions here?
Well, I think absolutely. We probably need also, reform UN a bit. But I think, maybe let's get a majority vote or something. That we cannot just have one country veto. For example, that last time when China proposed the resolution for Palestinian-Israel conflict, U.S. vetoed that. So,
Sorry, Henry, to interrupt. Would China actually support that?
No, I think of course, there's when China was the rotating chair of UN Security Council, I think last November. There was quite a bit discussion on that, and China even called for a global summit on this crisis. So I think we need to do that. We need to really have a high-level talk and talk about how we can really reform that. But let's get to the consensus. I think it's important to have the high-level summit. Let's get the five head of the state of the UN Security Council.
Sorry to interrupt again, Henry. Scott, I can see you nodding away there. What do you make of what Henry has just had to say?
Well, I think on the specifics of the UN, I think you asked an interesting question, and that is, would China support getting rid of the veto power in the Security Council, which has not only been used by Russia to hold up the Security Council and by the U.S. to hold up the Security Council, but China would have to give up its own veto as well. So certainly UN reform has to involve all major powers. But on a wider issue, and I'd be interested in Henry's thoughts on this, where I think U.S.-China may be different from the other crises we talk about is it looks like there's a concerted effort by the Biden administration and by China to get back to the rules of the game, whether that's the rules of the game over Taiwan, the South China Sea, over economic issues, over technical issues, or technological issues, including the issue of espionage.
What do you mean by rules of the game?
Rules of the game. I think rules of the game, and I'll refer back to the other issues and then get back to China, is that with Russia and Ukraine, and in the sense of order across Europe, Vladimir Putin violated the rules of the game in a conflict which has been going on since 2014, including Russian occupation of part of the country, by launching a direct military invasion. That's crossing a red line. Hamas broke the rules of the game with the nature of its attack on Israel on October 7th, because it carried out the mass killing of civilians. And then, of course, Israel breaks the rules of the game on a day upon day upon day basis with its indiscriminate war. With the U.S. and China, after a period of heightened tension in 2022, including over Taiwan, including over military issues, there has been an effort in the past year on both sides, including a series of high-level meetings in Beijing, to say, look, let's step back from confrontation. Let's agree to live and let live over a specific issue over China and over broader issues like economic and trade issues.
Yeah. Henry, I know you wanted to jump in there. Can you just, first of all, before you respond to Scott, can you just reiterate, would China actually be prepared to give up its veto powers at the UN?
No, I'm not saying that. I think that have to discuss of a UN reform. I mean, that's not China, just one country. I mean, we have all the countries talk together. Well, I think on this Palestinian-Israel conflict, we need to have a high-level UN summit. Let's get all the top leaders to come to the table. And also, Security Council member countries at the table. I think one of the fundamental problem, what we see happen in the Russian-Ukrainian war and all across Taiwan Strait, or what we see of the Palestinian-Israel conflict, is basically the fundamental loss to trust of the major powers. And then the reason for that is that some countries are unilaterally pursue a lot of policy, when decouple, de-risk, and whatever. So that really created a lot of mistrust. And also, when the Cold War ended, I mean, also, there's a lot of things has not been happening. And so I think the mistrust of the major powers led to this regional conflict, led to this regional, destabilized. So basically, the root of the problem lies in the major countries. We have to really put all the major countries at the table and talk and normalize their relation. That's the most important thing. Not view each other as enemy, rivalry. I mean, if the major power view each other as rivalry, enemy, and how can they really solve the regional problem where they have the profit war and whatever? That's really very bad.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about the leaders that are basically going to be making any decisions going forward here. You've got Putin, Biden, potentially Trump later this year, Netanyahu, Xi, Kim Jong-un, all taking, front row seats and controlling what is going to happen next. Chris, I know you've been scathing about many of these leaders. Are they the types of leaders that would be able to de-escalate, to take the tension out of the room, so to speak, to bring us back from the brink of a World War III?
Well, some of them. I mean, Netanyahu has long lobbied for a war with Iran. The Israel lobby was a major factor in pushing the United States into Iraq, although it had nothing to do with the attacks of 9/11. I really think the core issue here is the expansion of U.S. militarism. Remember, we spend more on our military than what the next 9 or 10 countries combined, including China and Russia. I covered Eastern and Central Europe, including the fall of East Germany in 1989 as a reporter, and I was there when the promises were made to Gorbachev not to extend NATO beyond the borders of a unified Germany. WikiLeaks released a cable written by William Burns, who was the ambassador to Russia, now the head of the CIA, who said Ukraine is a red line. essentially incorporating Ukraine into NATO is a provocation. It doesn't matter what your political perspective is, that is unacceptable to the Russian people. I'm paraphrasing. And so that expansion of NATO up to Russia's borders, the inability on the United States to intervene, 16 years, 2.3 million Gazans living in a concentration camp. These are, we have to put these things in context. The massive expansion of the U.S. military in the South China Sea. These are all provocations. And I fear that unless this expansionist policy that defines U.S. militarism is not put under control, I think that is the engine that is driving so much of the instability, the global instability. I really think, and there was no reason for the war in Ukraine. I mean, in fact, after a couple years of savage bloodletting, in which Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians are killed and wounded and much of the country destroyed, you're going to end up with a negotiation that could have been done before.
Yeah. Scott, I can see you're shaking your head almost right the way through what Chris was saying. We've only got a couple of minutes left. Can you just give your response, please?
The general response is that, stop using the U.S. as a punching bag or as a diversion. Yes, the U.S. and its military are to blame for a lot of what is going on, such as the 2003 war in Iraq. But it wasn't the U.S. military that invaded Ukraine and continues to attack Ukraine on a daily basis. That was Vladimir Putin. It wasn't the U.S. that attacked Israel or that attacked Gaza. That's Hamas and Israel that are involved there. And if you just simply shout about U.S. militarism, you forget the fact that this is a very complex system, such as the complex system in China. And you rule out the possibility that the U.S. and China can find a way forward together because you're simply shaking your fist and saying, well, Washington's always going to be the bad guy. It's too simplistic and it doesn't help us as analysts.
Yeah. Okay. Finally,
let me just say, Scott, I don't think that Washington's always the bad guy, but I spent 20 years on the outer reaches of empire covering U.S. militarism and proxy wars in Latin America and everywhere else. And there is no control anymore. It's a state within a state. And yes, certainly there are other actors.
Sorry, Chris. You're a good reporter, but as an analyst in 2023-24, you're giving up the job of reporting on a daily basis, where this is not just angels versus devils. No, there are good people and there are bad people.
I did not say it was. It's not angels versus devils. I'm no defender of Vladimir Putin, and what he committed was a war crime. But I think not to acknowledge that he was baited and provoked, it doesn't defend what he does.
He was not baited. He was not baited. He was not baited and provoked. And you just defended Vladimir Putin by using that inaccurate assessment. That's what I mean about sticking with facts.
I covered. I was there in Eastern. I covered it. I was there as a reporter. I watched the whole process. So
you were not.
I strongly disagree.
I don't think that.
We're going to have to leave it there. We really do appreciate your time, gentlemen. Chris, Scott, and Henry, thank you very much for your time and your insights here on Inside Story. Thank you. Well, thank you also for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. Well, from me, Tom McRae, and the whole team here, goodbye for now.